All right, guys, episode number 7 here of the series, NQ and RSP. So now deviating from the VIX, putting our focus into the other two contextual instruments that we use within the contextual analyses. And in this video, we're just going to be defining these two names, talking about why they're important, and then we can talk about actually applying these two instruments. So how they actually integrate into the contextual analyses, so that we can have a better understanding of the market that we're operating in, which will allow us to make better quality decisions within ES. So this video is going to be boring as fuck. A lot of words, a lot of statistics. Not really. I mean, I would say relatively more information than the other videos, but this is important, right? There's a difference between being able to regurgitate a strategy and actually understanding why you make decisions within that strategy. Like, why do you actually use NQ and RSP? You have to understand what they are and what they represent first. And by understanding this internal information, this really allows us to operate with more confidence in the market. So let's get into it. So just to reiterate the hierarchy of the contextual analyses, VIX always comes first, and then NQ and RSP come second. So the reason, just to touch up on this again, that the VIX comes first is because it establishes a directional bias. We always want to understand what side of the market is in control first. NQ and RSP are also monitored. These two names provide insight into how the broader market and technology sector are performing. So that's going to be very, very relevant for us as S&P 500 futures traders, more specifically CLC traders. However, they are used primarily for observation rather than playing a central role in the decision-making process. The central decision-making process is going to be VIX, contextually. So what is NQ? So NQ is a stock index, meaning it's just an assortment of 100 different companies. It is market cap weighted, and of those 100 companies, it's representing the largest non-financial companies listed on the NASDAQ stock exchange. So why is this relevant? Why is this important to us? So of these 100 companies listed in the NASDAQ 100, a majority of them are classified within the IT sector or are primarily tech-driven businesses. So obviously you've got your IT sector names like Apple, right? A lot of big names, Tesla, for example, which is listed in consumer discretionary, is primarily a tech-driven business. So although it's not listed in IT, we can just classify it as a tech company, I like to, because it's primarily tech-driven, right? Advances and revolutionary technologies that come out, Tesla is going to be using those, and therefore their company is going to be largely driven and influenced by tech. So info technology, or the info tech sector, plus tech adjacent companies like Tesla, for example, account for roughly 70 to 80% of the NASDAQ's total market cap. So basically we can just call the NASDAQ tech, right? It is a proxy for the technology sector. So if NQ is strong, what that's revealing to us is that the tech leadership is performing well. On the other side, if it's weak, tech leadership is underperforming. And so, as I said, later on, we'll understand why this is actually relevant for S&P 500 futures trading. But just understand that the NASDAQ is a proxy for the tech sector. So what is RSP? RSP tracks the same 500 companies as the S&P 500, but it's going to weigh each stock equally instead of market cap. So within the S&P 500, just take the Magnificent Seven, for example, Mag 7. These 7 companies, NVIDIA, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Tesla, Meta, etc., these names account for nearly a third, I want to say, of the market cap by the S&P 500. So that's 7 companies out of 500, right? That's very disproportionate. That's not a very good way of understanding if the overall broader market is participating in a move. And that is very important for us. That's called market breadth, and RSP allows us to see that. So by RSP equally weighting these stocks instead of market cap, it means that names like Apple and Microsoft will not dominate the index, and every stock is going to have roughly the same influence. And so because RSP equally weighs all of these stocks, it provides a clearer view of the overall performance of the S&P 500, and its movement reflects the average performance, aka market breadth, rather than the performance of a small group of dominant names. So we want to understand, like, if ES is moving to the upside, is that move being supported by the overall market, or is it just being influenced and driven by a few names, by like Apple and Nvidia and like a couple of the very, very large market cap names? Because if that's the case, and if the move is only being driven by a few names, then that means that that move is more fragile. And it's when it's less supported by the overall market, then it's going to have a lower likelihood of sustaining to the upside. Because if, for example, Apple and Nvidia start to turn back to the downside, well, then obviously that move is not going to sustain. On the flip side, if that move is being supported by the overall broader market, then that move is going to have a higher likelihood of sustaining. So if RSP is strong, that means that the overall broader market is performing well. If RSP is weak, that means that the overall broader market is underperforming. So those are the basics of NQ and RSP. NQ is just a proxy for tech, and RSP watches the average performance of stocks within the S&P 500. So now we can actually move on to why that's important for the S&P 500. So the S&P 500 is comprised of 503 companies. 75 to 85 of those names are information technology and tech-driven companies, roughly within that range. And of those 75 to 85, out of the 500 companies, which numerically only represents like 15% of the S&P 500, those 15% of names, those 75 to 85 companies, make up roughly half of the market cap of the S&P 500. What that means is that tech is very important in shaping the movement of the S&P 500. And so we'll get into that more down here. The remaining 420 companies each have smaller market caps, but together they reflect the overall broader market's performance. And so because tech and tech-driven companies account for nearly half of the market cap within the S&P 500, monitoring tech performance is critical. And so a good way for us to watch that tech performance is through NQ. Simply because NQ, or the companies within NQ represent, or tech and tech-driven names within NQ represent 70 to 80% of its market cap. So at the same time, while the remaining companies carry less individual weight, they collectively represent the broader market, which RSP captures very effectively. So half of the market cap within the S&P 500 is driven by tech. And we can say that the other half is just driven by the overall broader market. So NQ plus RSP effectively equal the S&P 500. And so by looking at those two names together, they allow us to evaluate the strength and support of moves in ES. So we were able to go through that quickly. That is, on a surface level and in summation, what NQ and what RSP represent. And again, the reason that this is important for us is because the S&P 500, half of its market cap is essentially driven by tech and tech adjacent companies, which the NQ encapsulates very well. And the other half can just be classified as the overall broader market, companies with smaller market caps, which the RSP allows us to gain insight into. So both of those together allow us to understand and evaluate the strength and support of moves in ES. And so we'll gain more perspective and knowledge into how that's actually happening in the next video, applying NQ and RSP.